If one element binds the demonstrations that have roiled the cities and towns of America for the last week, beyond the full-throated cry for an end to racial and social injustice, it is the nerve-jangling unpredictability, the uneasy sense that everything could change in an instant.
All that has been required is the firing of one rubber bullet, the spraying of one can of mace, the tossing of one lighted firecracker, one precipitating action.
Take Sunday, for example, the last day of a difficult May. Hundreds of fraught confrontations played out across the country between protesters and police officers, some devolving into violence in a finger snap.
In Atlanta, a mostly peaceful protest march turned into a hailstorm of tear gas canisters after demonstrators toppled a fence. In Denver, a bearded young man in a sea of protesters crumpled to the ground when a projectile fired by the police struck him in the face. And in Washington, a tense standoff quickly became a conflagration that included a fire in the basement of a historic church that President Trump would briefly stand in front of for a photo op, presumably to convey order, the next day.
Unpredictability infuses the air.
And what does unpredictability smell like? It is the commingling of street sweat and fire smoke and tear gas. The smoke smacks of destruction, while the tear gas seems to set your face aflame, burning your throat and causing your eyes to tear so badly that it seems you may never stop crying.
In this protracted state of unrest, not seen in this country in a half-century, any certainty was absent, with the anger, fear and opportunism of demonstrations filling the void. Was that a firecracker or a gunshot?
Nights in America are now when the fever burns the hottest, a fever that set in on Memorial Day, when Derek Chauvin, a white police officer, pressed his knee to the neck of George Floyd, a black man lying face down on a Minneapolis street, for nearly 9 minutes. The tactic was employed against a man accused of fobbing off a counterfeit $20 bill, and whose death was captured in a widely disseminated video.
Mr. Chauvin was ultimately charged with third-degree murder, but the demonstrations of fury triggered by the encounter have shown no signs of abating, with some protesters demanding the arrests of 3 other Minneapolis officers at the scene.
The horrific death of Mr. Floyd followed an all too familiar pattern of black boys and men being killed by the police. The names of others, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown among them, are embedded in the American consciousness.
What's more, the demonstrations are taking place in the midst of another unsettling American reality. In little more than 3 months, the coronavirus pandemic has killed more than 100,000 Americans, pushed another 40 million into unemployment, and upended much of everyday life.
These realities now run like an undercurrent through hundreds of protests in small towns and large cities. Some were heated but peaceful. Some seemed relatively calm, only to explode into personal injury and property damage. And some devolved into chaos, causing the kind of damage that volunteers with brooms could not sweep away in the morning.
At a Sunday evening protest in Oakland, California, a 5-year-old boy named Chase Butler hung out the back window of his family's white minivan, his right hand raised in a fist, his left holding a cardboard sign that said, "Mama, I can't breath, don't shoot."
His father, Donovan Butler, 33, said he had had the talk, with his son. "The world we live in is not equal," Mr. Butler said. He explained. "People look at us different."
More often, though, the talk on Sunday came in the form of chants and shouts and police orders barked through loudspeakers. More often, the dynamic was too fluid and uncertain to guarantee the safety of a 5-year-old boy, or even that of a family in a minivan.
In Atlanta, hundreds of protesters marched for miles in peace, chanting out their cries for justice. Then, at the edge of Centennial Olympic Park, an organizer warned them to veer away because demonstrators ahead of them were clashing with the police. Few listened, even as others warned them of tear gas and conflict.
"Oh, y'all going the wrong way," one man said. He received a few insults in return for his concern.
Then somebody tipped over a portable toilet at a construction site. Then people started chanting. Then a group of young, masked white men began tearing apart a blue tarped fence that was blocking the street, ignoring a black woman's cries to stop because they're going to blame it on us. The fence came down, and hell broke loose. Firecrackers, running. A plume of tear gas, its canisters clattering on the pavement. The burning of faces and eyes, the streams of tears and mucus, the only relief coming from a man squirting a milky solution from a bottle. In Minneapolis, where Mr. Floyd was killed and where the protests began nearly a week earlier, a similar confrontation unfolded shortly after the 8 p.m. curfew, and, thus, with an air of inevitability.
As a beautiful sunset took shape, hundreds of vociferous protesters clustered near a gas station in Bobby and Steve's Auto World downtown, all but boxed in by walls of police officers wearing body armor and holding batons.
"We're just sitting ducks," a man said.
A committed group sat and knelt in the street and continued to chant. "We're saying we're sick of this," a woman shouted into a megaphone, to which the crowd responded, "No justice, no peace."
A helicopter buzzed overhead, as the numbers of police officers and members of the National Guard multiplied.
Then, suddenly, at 8:43 p.m., the police fired tear gas into the crowd, a plume arcing across the sky. Stumbling and coughing, some demonstrators took cover behind gas pumps. Some held up their hands and chanted, "Hands up! Don't shoot!" And some took another form of action, filming it all on their cell phones.
With the warm air charged with the acrid smell of tear gas, the walls of the police began to close in. A few protesters tried to run, but soon realized there was no use, they were surrounded.
A young man with a skateboard ran across the gas station lot in a vain attempt to escape. He pleaded with a guardsman that he simply wanted to go home.
"You were supposed to go home an hour ago," the guardsman answered.
Then came a voice booming from the loudspeaker of an armored vehicle. "This is the Minnesota State Patrol," the voice said. "Lay down. You're under arrest. Get down on the ground."
Among those arrested was Kevin Trin. He said that he had been hit in the thigh with a projectile, and that he had only come to the protests to take photographs.
"My mom is probably worried," Mr. Trin said, his voice quavering. "I want my mom."
The police lined up the demonstrators, bound with flex cuffs, and led them to waiting vans. The process was strangely cordial. People who seemed like enemy combatants moments earlier were now just people talking.
But a peaceful resolution to an anxious standoff was not uniformly realized. At about the same time the confrontation in Minneapolis ended, a woman was shot in the arm in Walnut Creek, Calif, in the midst of the widespread looting of dozens of stores. The city, about 25 miles east of San Francisco, immediately imposed a curfew, with police officers sealing a freeway exit with flares and traffic cones.
In Washington, an ugly push and pull between protesters and the police continued. Demonstrators poured accelerants on a wooden pole supporting a road work ahead sign and set it on fire in the middle of H Street, adding further fuel with branches wrenched from nearby trees. A small fire was also set in the basement nursery of the 204-year-old St. John's Church, known as the Church of Presidents, causing relatively minor damage.
The dull clunk of projectiles against the raised shields of police officers echoed through Lafayette Square, across Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House. It was just one of the many jarring sounds of violence and vandalism unfolding a few hundred yards from where the President of the United States and his family were protected this night by a phalanx of National Guard troops.
Across the country and into the night, the unpredictability continued, now peaceful, now not.
In Seattle, demonstrators knelt before police blockades to convey their peaceful intent, and were rewarded with the invitation to continue their march of protest.
In Los Angeles, troops holding M4 rifles stood on the steps of City Hall, while protesters taunted soldiers and police officers in the streets. One moment a woman was offering her hand to a soldier who accepted it, leading to a hug. The next, another woman was taunting a black officer, yelling, "Do you get bonuses to shoot black people?"
In Denver, hundreds marched through streets thick with the cough-inducing remnants of tear gas. Protesters wore ski goggles and scuba masks to protect their eyes. Fireworks exploded overhead, emitting a sound that could easily be mistaken for gunfire.
And in New York, well into Monday morning, people walked the streets of the Soho neighborhood with armloads of goods just stolen from smashed-in luxury stores, as two New York Police Department vans drove down Houston Street. The officers inside those vans could be seen with their heads bowed.
Overall, the night of uncertainty carried a strange feeling of anonymity. Many police officers were concealed behind riot gear armor, with many protesters wearing masks and scarves, and not only because of the highly contagious coronavirus.
It was as though the country could not quite recognize itself.
Reporting was contributed by Tim Arango, Mike Baker, Peter Baker, Kim Barker, John Elegon, Richard Fawcett, Kimiko de Freitas Tamura, Thomas Fuller, Jack Healy, Patricia Matze, Sean McCreesh, Jack Nikas, Adam Popescu, Nate Schweber and Dion Searcy.